Good morning, Jeremiah. There you are.
Good morning. My name is Doug Beach, and I'm the chair of the Pathways to Hope Steering Committee and the president of NAMI San Antonio. And we want to welcome everybody to the 6th annual Pathways to Hope conference. 6 years ago, we began this conference as a way to invite people from across our community to come together to talk about mental health and help break the stigma of mental illness. And we began that conversation 6 years ago, and we're still talking. This year, we're virtual again, as we were last year, due to COVID-19. To date, we've lost 3,817 people to COVID-19 in Bexar County. We've lost family, friends, neighbors, and community members to COVID. My friend Beau Gilliam died about 2 to 3 weeks ago. I first met Beau about 10 years ago when he moved to San Antonio, was trying to find a place to live and find work. And over the next 10 years, Beau found his way. He found work, he found a place to live thanks to the Salvation Army, First Presbyterian Church, Haven for Hope, and later worked at the Center for Healthcare Services as a certified peer specialist. Beau learned about his own mental health disorder, how to build a new life with many friends, and how to take care of himself. So I want to dedicate this conference this year to the many people who have lost their lives to COVID, to the people who have often persevered through their own mental health challenges, and to the many groups and people in San Antonio who have walked alongside them during this difficult time. So thank you to all those who have helped this year.
We're so sorry about the loss of your friend, Doug, and our prayers go out to the other people who have lost loved one during this time of season of COVID. As awesome as last year's conference was, this year's conference will be equally impacting and life-changing. We have a mix of outstanding plenary speakers, and our workshops are separated into 4 tracks for you. We have the faith community engagement track, we have the mental health track, peer programs, and the therapy counseling.
We want to thank the people who have helped make this conference possible. And our list of sponsors and community partners are on the website for you to look at. But I especially want to thank Bexar County and County Judge Nelson Wolf, the City of San Antonio, Anna Helmke and Melody Woolsey, West Care Recast Foundation, Beverly Watts Davis, all the people at NAMI San Antonio who have worked all year on this, First Presbyterian Church, who's our founding sponsor, St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and Virtual Productions, Inc., which is helping produce this conference today. And my thanks to the Pathways to Hope Steering Committee and to all those community partners who have helped spread the word and bring over 1,000 people to this conference. Working on this conference has been a great experience from year one. And one of the great things about the conference that has made this a great conference to be part of is that everybody has said yes when we've asked them to participate. But most of all, this has been an act of faith on the part of a lot of people and an answer to prayer.
And Doug, we know powerful things happen when we put faith and prayer together. But first, I got to give you a little information about CEUs. CEUs are again being offered for our workshops, and we'll tell you more about it as you get your CEUs at the beginning of each workshop session. And speaking of prayer and faith, I'd like to ask Reverend Dr. Kemp, the senior pastor of the Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, to help us open the conference with an invocation. Reverend Kemp.
Dr. Kemp, you're on mute.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Good morning, Mr. Beach. Thank you, Reverend Blue. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share in this Pathways to Hope conference in the virtual environment. I'm honored to be a part. I want to certainly congratulate Pathways to Hope because of the work that is done through Pathways to Hope to bring together healthcare and the faith community is very admirable. As many of you may know, I seek to bring together health and faith on a daily basis in my work as a physician and as a pastor. It's not always easy though, because sometimes we have a situation where those who are in healthcare disavow the benefits of faith, and then those who are in faith disavow the benefits of healthcare. But the unalterable truth is we need both. We need the science of healthcare. We need the benefits of faith to promote healing. It is with both ministry and medicine that we become whole. And so at this time, we will pause to offer some prayers unto the Lord in these difficult times. Certainly these difficult times, which have challenged us in terms of our faith, even in terms of our healthcare, because of the isolation, the quarantine, the pain, and all that has occurred in this awful pandemic. So let us go before the Lord in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for this time together. We come before your presence, lifting you up, giving you praise and giving you honor. We come acknowledging that you are sovereign and recognizing that you are the miraculous sustainer of our lives. We thank you for all of the wonderful things that you have done. Now grant unto us forgiveness of our transgressions. Cover us with your grace, with your mercy. Allow us to enter into your holy throne room. We also come acknowledging the sadness that comes with sickness, the pain that comes with an unpredictable predicament, bewilderment of grief. We come acknowledging the uncertainty of an ongoing pandemic. Yet we trust you. We know that you are our pathway to hope. You are our deliverer. So God, we bring all of our concerns, all of our burdens, all of our issues, and place them at your feet. Now we pray that you will just cover those of us who are still struggling, who are still dealing with the issues of life. That you'll just cover us with your grace and your mercy, and that you will engulf us with the comfort of your love. We also pray for this Pathways to Hope conference. We pray that what is said and done here will be an inspiration to all who participate. We pray that you'll touch every presenter. Then God, we pray that all that will transpire will be transformative for our lives. We know that you can, and we know that you will. Therefore, we count it already done. Thank you for hearing and answering our prayer. With the peace that surpasses all understanding, we submit these requests in your holy name. Amen. And thank God.
Amen. And thank you, Dr. Kemp, as always, for being such a strong part of our community, for being part of Pathways. You were in on our first conference 6 years ago, and it's wonderful having you again this year. Thank you.
God bless. Thanks.
We want to now hear from San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, who will address the conference.
We've all had a rough 18 months as the COVID-19 pandemic spread through our community in several surges. The latest surge was spawned by the highly contagious Delta variant. Along with the physical ravages of this disease, COVID-19 has caused significant stress and mental health consequences. The combination of economic stress, dealing with our children's school, and other ramifications of the pandemic has been tough for us all. The pandemic continues along with the mental toll. We can best address mental health with our friends and loved ones through understanding and compassion. Being a compassionate community takes large doses of imagination and vision, intentional action, and trusting relationships committed to community. Practicing and exercising all these approaches can strengthen the muscles of compassion. One example of a compassionate community approach is Bridges to Care. It started in partnership between the city and NAMI. Cohorts of congregations are receiving mental health training from compassionate companionship to suicide prevention, from trauma-informed care to the sustainability of this work, from mental health first aid to accessing resources through the San Antonio Community Resource Directory. Cohorts are developing across the city and in all 10 council districts. That illustrates the vision needed to address the mental health needs spawned by COVID-19, a vision that directly engages education, followed by intentional actions. Another good example is in our public safety sector, where we are creating multidisciplined response teams, including mental health caregivers. This holds much potential, and we're taking great care forming those. Talking about mental health must be a priority. Holistic healing involves the mind, body, and community. Together, we need to emphasize community at every level, in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our school districts. Community connects across all major care providers and professionals. It takes community to make community. It takes compassion to create compassion. October is Mental Health Awareness Month. A year ago at this very conference, it was decided to begin Bridges to Care San Antonio on October 1st. We did. And now 15 congregational cohorts are in progress. Almost 300 people have gone through training. Just imagine what we could do even in the next month. We could increase mental wellness and increase compassion within our community. Just imagine, no boundaries, no borders, only potential. Thank you, Pathways to Hope, NAMI San Antonio, Bexar County, West Care, and our own Department of Human Services faith-based initiative. Thank you all for supporting and taking your valuable time to invest in opening our hearts and imagining our San Antonio as a compassionate city.
Thank you, Mayor, for your vision of San Antonio becoming a compassionate city. We are praying for you, and we are going to make that vision come to pass. Now, I would like to introduce someone to the Pathways to Hope Conference family, Dr. Miriam Delphin-Rittmon. Dr. Delfin-Rittmon is currently Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and she's the administrator of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Prior to her current appointment, Dr. Delphin-Rittmon was an adjunct associate professor at Yale University, where she served on the faculty for the past 20 years. Through her 20-year career in the behavioral health field, Dr. Delphin-Rittmon has extensive experience in the design, evaluation, and administration of mental health, substance use, and prevention services and systems. Welcome to Pathways to Hope, Dr. Ritman, Dr. Delphin-Rittmon.
we're working on pulling her in right now.
We're running a few minutes ahead of time, so Dr. Ritman may take her just a moment to come on the screen, but everybody stick with us.
Hello.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Looking forward to this session and appreciate the invitation.
We've already gone ahead and let the audience know about your background, and so the mic is yours, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a set of slides. I don't know if somebody is planning on projecting those or. Oh, here we go. Fantastic. Okay. So, I just have to say, I so appreciate the invitation to be here and to talk with you all. One thing I did want to say is I will try to pay attention to the chat as I go through my slides. So if folks have a question, certainly feel free to pop it in the chat and I'll try to get to those. And then, I've let the conference organizer and team know that I can certainly, any questions I don't get to, it's certainly fine to send them and we can get you all a response. So I'll just dive right in. So it sounds like I was going to do a bit of introduction, but it sounds like you've done that. And I just have to say, it's just been such a pleasure and honor to be able to join and be back at SAMHSA again, this time as Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use. Such an important time, and I look forward to, I see us all as partners in this important work, especially now as we're experiencing together the ripple effects of the pandemic. And we know increasingly addressing mental health and increasing awareness around mental health is important, and substance use and mental health promotion even is more important now than ever, and promoting recovery is more important now than ever. So next slide, I'll just dive right in. I know I have about 20 minutes, so it's a lot of slides, but I will go through them quickly. So I'll just do a quick overview. I'm going to talk about just some of the federal commitments and resources that SAMHSA has received as a function of the strong commitment to addressing COVID from the Biden administration, and then our work with just turning those around and getting them out to states and communities quickly. We'll talk a little bit about some of the pandemic ripple effects that we've all been seeing and experiencing, and then some of the SAMHSA programs that we have in place to address a range of mental health. And I'll focus primarily on mental health, but certainly some of the programs that we're funding address substance use and prevention and recovery as well. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I'm going to start with a little bit about some of our priorities, just a quick snapshot, at a glance. Of course, SAMHSA's continuing mission since 1992 really has been to reduce the impact of mental health and substance use on communities across the country. Our priorities, we do have a set of near-term priorities that we have developed. We'll soon be embarking in a more formal strategic planning process to develop our 5-year strategic plan, but currently have developed 5 near-term priorities as a function of quite a bit of stakeholder input. And I'm real excited about that part. I think the stakeholder input and participation is so critical. So I will, go through those. And I do see a question in terms of what areas would I want the behavioral health field to advocate for, and I'll get to that when I talk about some of the some different areas. In terms of the staffing at SAMHSA, one goal for me has been to sort of revitalize and re-energize SAMHSA. We do have a number of vacancies, so certainly continue to look out for our job callings. We have 183 vacancies, and so a real goal of mine is to bring in expertise from around the country within our major centers and offices. And I'm real excited about that because, again, this work is so important as always, but more important now than ever. Our current budget request is about $9.7 billion. We've also received about $3.5 billion in American Rescue Plan dollars. And I'll talk a little bit about how those resources have been disseminated. Next slide, please. So real quickly, these are some of our near-term priorities. These priorities also align with the areas that the Behavioral Health Coordinating Council, we are using these for that council as well that I chair with Dr. Levine. But essentially, it's preventing overdose. We know this is so critical now. We've seen the overdose rates, unfortunately, continue to rise, which is very heartbreaking. And we know fentanyl is a big part of that work. And so preventing overdose is definitely a key SAMHSA priority. Also enhancing access to suicide prevention and crisis care, significant priority area, particularly as we know we have the 988 crisis line and crisis initiative that is due to go live July 2022. I see that as just a complete game changer in terms of crisis responsiveness and how we respond to crisis. And so really excited about that important work. Again, that'll be a nationwide 988 number for suicide prevention and crisis care. Also, another priority is promoting youth and children's behavioral health. Such an important area now as we've seen young people particularly struggle through the pandemic. So that's a real critical priority. Integrating primary care and behavioral health remains a priority. It's so important to have healthcare integration, and it creates more entryways into both primary care, but also into behavioral health services. And so that sort of integration is real critical. And then another area that's real important is, using our data and metrics to be able to ensure, continuous quality improvement, that our funding initiatives are doing what we would like them to look at our data to be able to assess for equity, so much that we can garner from our data and using that effectively. In terms of cross-cutting areas, these are all, so equity is a real cross-cutting area. It's so critical that, through our grant programs and internally through our work, that we do all that we can to promote equity and access to the services and programs that we fund for diverse racial and ethnic and cultural groups, across the cultural spectrum broadly defined. Workforce we know is critical. It's so important that an important cross-cutting issue. It's so important that the workforce is ready to meet the needs that we're currently facing as a nation. So training is important here. Thinking about the next generation of behavioral health providers, definitely a priority here in terms of workforce. Financing is critical in terms of how we think about sustainability, and additionally, how we think about financing behavioral health across the country. So certainly our collaborations with other federal partners, including CMS, is real critical here. And then of course, recovery. I see recovery is undergirding, all of the work that we do, because ultimately our work is about helping people to live full, whole, meaningful lives in communities of their choosing, alongside any mental health or substance use challenges that they may be experiencing. And so recovery is an important priority for SAMHSA. Next slide, please. You have to go a little bit quicker. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the federal commitments. I mean, just feel so fortunate to be part of this administration now. President Biden has been, and Vice President Harris is committed to addressing the impacts of COVID. And so I'll talk about some of the funding that we have received to address this. Racial equity is a priority as well. And so all of these areas, what I appreciate is our SAMHSA priorities really align well with the administration's priorities, and appreciate the funding support we've received. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I do see the questions coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these quickly, and then I'll go to the chat and try to get at some of those questions. Secretary Becerra is absolutely wonderful. I've so appreciated the meetings I've had with him. He is poised to, supportive of SAMHSA, moving forward the nation's health agenda to include behavioral health. We know behavioral health is a critical part of health, and the Secretary believes that, and we're in lockstep in terms of moving forward, the behavioral health agenda for the country. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about, again, some of this COVID supplemental funding. SAMHSA thankfully has received $4.25 billion. Again, these resources, the goal across the board is to work to increase access to mental health, substance use prevention services and supports. You'll see how these funds are allocated. Our certified community behavioral health clinics, we recently announced 100 additional CCBHCs, so that is really exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that work. It certainly has been an opportunity to grow our peer and recovery workforce, to also ensure that across the country, there are a range of wraparound services and supports that are provided through these CCBHCs, to include integrated care. And so these are the areas that where the COVID funding has focused as an overall goal of working to increase access to both mental health and substance use and prevention services and supports. Project Aware, I'll just mention that, is a real important initiative that is school-based. It's focused on increasing access to necessary services and supports, promoting wellness and resilience for young people within a school-based setting. And so we're real pleased about that work that's going on across the country and territories to include our tribal partners. Next slide, please. And so in terms of American Rescue Plan dollars, same thing. I mean, these are overall goal to increase access to mental health, substance use services, as well as prevention supports across the country. And again, to include our tribal partners. It has included $1.5 billion both for the mental health and substance use block grant, as well as, again, Project Aware. Our suicide prevention work has received additional funding, and again, our CCBHCs, so certified community behavioral health clinics. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of our budget for FY22, so $9.7 billion. You'll see how the funds sort of break down by center in terms of each of our 4 centers. And these are some of the larger funding streams within those centers that comprise this overall budget. I won't go into all of these, but these are just a few of the priority areas. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, such critical work, pleased to be able to fund that and to continue that important work countrywide. And so all of these areas have been funded or are part of the FY22 budget. Next slide, please. What this slide does, and we're, I love this type of mapping. Essentially what we've done is we've mapped for each center, the top 3, funding awards in terms of amounts, and mapped them across, each of the priority areas. What I love about this is it lets us see, where we might have gaps, where we might want to scale up. It lets us see how our funding areas map onto the various priority areas that we've outlined as our core term priorities. This is not comprehensive, of course, but just an example of some of the areas as they align with our priorities. You'll see that, again, using data for continued quality improvement is a real critical SAMHSA strategy. Next slide, please. I'm going to try to boogie through these so we can get, okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about just some of the ripple effects that we've been seeing from the pandemic. And, it's something we've all been talking about, but certainly the data is bearing out the conversations that we've been having as a nation. But, we know the pandemic has had significant ripple effects. In many ways, it can be conceptualized as a collective national trauma, if you will, worldwide trauma, really, if you will. And so some of these patterns and trends illustrate that. We know overdoses are up 75% in the early months of the pandemic. When we look at emergency department visits, they're up as well when we compare mid-March to mid-October 2020, compared to that same time period in 2019. We've seen a significant increase in suicide attempts. Unfortunately, also a significant increase in overdose. So 26% increase in suicide attempts, 36% increase in overdoses during that time period. ED visits are also up for young people for ages 5 to 11, up 24%, 12 to 17, up 31%. We're also receiving more calls to the suicide lifeline, up 10 to 30%. So in some days, receiving 7,000 calls per day. So the significant ripple effects we're seeing as a function of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So this slide here, I mean, it again shows, again, some of the ripple effects that we're seeing. So increases in anxiety from when we look from August 2020 to February 2021, and this is CDC data, we see increases in anxiety from 34 to 41%. So that's a pretty significant increase. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the same thing. We see high rates of unmet need for care. And so it lets us know certainly, working to connect people to services and supports remains critical. So again, this shows an increase from 9.2% to 11.7% in terms of unmet mental health care. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk about just some of the services and supports. I love the comments that are coming in. Thank you for everyone's comments. I did see this one says, I'm excited about my leadership. Well, I have to say, I'm just thrilled, and it's such an honor to be in this role. I can't say it enough, and just totally see us all as partners. Diversity, this has been a critical part of my work throughout my career. And so, when I was at Sampson before, there's quite a bit of work going on related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know it's a critical aspect of developing quality care. It's especially important now because we know that diverse racial and ethnic and cultural groups have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so some of the SAMHSA initiatives that we have in place anyway, because again, this is an important part of services and supports. And I'll talk about some of the initiatives in particular that get at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. So one initiative, and I was so excited to come back to SAMHSA and see this in place, because when I was there from 2012 to 2014, this is one of the initiatives that I worked on, and just awesome that they continue to take it to the next level. But essentially, it's our disparity impact strategy and disparity impact statement. And essentially what this is, it's an approach within SAMHSA and now more broadly within HHS, where we're geared towards and focused on having a greater strategic focus on racial and ethnic populations within our investments, that we use data for continuous quality improvement to address racial and ethnic disparities within our programs. And that we also are linking this work with the broader, work within the administration and other HHS agencies. Real quick, the disparity impact statement, which we are looking to expand more broadly across our grants. Currently, it's a requirement just of our discretionary grants. A grantee essentially with the disparity impact statement, they're required to indicate particular groups that they will be addressing through the grant, and then the ways in which they will use data to evaluate the impacts of the work on groups that may be at-risk groups within there, or targeted, I don't like that word targeted, but selected groups or identified groups in terms of possible disparities, and then the ways in which they'll use the class standards to help address any of the disparities that they anticipate given what they see within their demographic area. Next slide, please. So this work I am so excited about because probably within my second or third week at SAMHSA, we were able to announce that we were funding 100 additional certified community behavioral health centers. We now have 340 CCBHCs across the country. The wonderful thing about the CCBHCs is, again, it's an opportunity to provide integrated care So not just primary care and mental health, but also as an opportunity to address substance use services as well. It has been an opportunity to significantly grow our peer and recovery workforce. That's also one of the programs and services that's part of the CCBHC model. So peer support specialists are part of the model, as well as wraparound recovery services and supports like housing, employment, psychosocial skills. And so the fact that we have now 340 CCBHCs and are continuing to grow this work with some of the additional resources that we've received from the American Rescue Plan resources, I think is a significant initiative for SAMHSA. Next slide. I see the questions coming in, so I'm going to try to go through these quick so I can get to a few of those. Project Aware. So Project Aware also is an initiative that I'm so excited about. It stands for Advancing Wellness and Resiliency in Education. It is a program that, again, is school-based. It's focused on promoting resiliency and wellness within a school setting, also with connecting young people with services and supports that they may need within the school setting or community. And so, in fact, we have an announcement, I believe, going out soon about additional Project Aware grants that will be awarded. And thank you. Somebody just let me know I have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to try to cook through these real quick so I can get to the great questions that are coming in. So next slide, please. Another real critical initiative, and I talked about this already, so I won't spend too much time with this, but essentially is our 988, so implementation of the national national crisis line. This program, and I use this phrase often because I truly believe in it as a clinical community psychologist. I think this project more than ever will totally exemplify that. But this is truly an all hands on deck project, an initiative. It is a game changer in terms of how we think about crisis response and suicide prevention. That will have a single line that people can call to be able to get help when they need it and where they need it, to include ultimately mobile crisis. Oh, 5 minutes remaining, not 10. Okay. So we know 988 is a real critical intervention that will require a range of different partners, as you see listed here. Next slide, please. No, and I might just I'll go through these last few too quickly. Faith, the work with faith communities is so critical. It provides an important opportunity to be able to increase help-seeking behavior, to increase access to services and supports. And so we are real pleased to support faith-based initiatives and collaborations, and are always excited to see these types of projects and initiatives come in. Next slide, please. Okay, great. And so, this is my last slide. And so I just want to conclude with, again, SAMHSA, we are committed to continuing to address the range of behavioral health needs we're seeing across the country. I totally believe in just a multi-system, multi-stakeholder, multi-partnership process. And so again, see all of you as critical partners in this work that we're journeying through together. And so I'm going to stop there just so I can go into the chat and look through some of the questions, because a lot of really great questions came in. So I'm just going to scroll up and just try to get at some of these. Okay, thank you. Okay, what primary issues would you like for the behavioral health field to advocate for to their congressional representatives? It's a great question. I think, one thing that I remember from my calls with other commissioners, they would say, if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. And so, there may be, I would say, think about your regions, think about what you're seeing on the ground and what's going to make a difference in terms of addressing the behavioral health needs of the people within your region. You've seen the priority areas. Those are the things that we're excited about and that SAMHSA is advocating for. To the extent that what you're seeing aligns with, those priority areas, those certainly are important areas, certainly that we're looking at. So I just recommend, I think it's important for advocacy to be contextually congruent There's this term sometimes context competent. So, advocate as it aligns with the needs that you're seeing within your communities. The nice thing is that, all of that bubbles up and we're able to see themes, themes and patterns and trends as it relates to the advocacy, but certainly the areas that I outlined, both in terms of the 5 areas and the cross-cutting areas in terms of recovery, workforce, finances, and then the 5 other areas are all critical areas. Okay, let me see other questions here. Let me just scroll down. What initiatives will SAMHSA be doing to increase diversity in the behavioral health field as it's an ongoing barrier to effective care? Our disparity impact statements, scaling those up across our grants, I think is one real critical initiative that will help to address diversity and behavioral health equity in terms of the behavioral health field. Also, we're doing this other initiative called the Elevate CBOs, so Elevate Community-Based Organizations. And the goal of that is to bring community-based organizations together to be able to share strategies, resources, ways in which the community organizations have maybe adapted evidence-based practices to make them culturally congruent and community and contextually congruent. So this is an ongoing priority, and stay tuned. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is that the Office of Minority Health has put out a behavioral health guide to the class standards. So behavioral health guide to cultural and linguistic competence standards. We'll be working very closely with OMH to help disseminate those resources and to disseminate that guide. Because it has wonderful program examples of cultural competence or culturally congruent programs and initiatives, and it has great information about how to implement those class standards. I think I'm probably running down on my time, but I'll stop there. And again, I just want to say thank you all so much. I so appreciate the invitation to be able to present today, and look forward to our ongoing and continued partnership. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Delphin-Rittmon. Great comment. It's always impressive to hear the breadth of the activities that SAMHSA is undertaking. And I know in our community, we value the partnership with SAMHSA, particularly through West Care Foundation and Recast in San Antonio. And Beverly Watts Davis has been wonderful to work with and been a key part of our conference here. So thank you for taking time. There's always more to cover, I'm sure. But we appreciate the time you've taken today, and we wish you best in your new position.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. So take care, everyone. Have a great conference.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Tim Murphy. And each year we try to bring an advocate, somebody on the national stage who's an advocate for mental health. And Dr. Murphy is certainly falls in that category. Dr. Murphy is a former U.S. representative, a psychologist. And at the time when he was in Congress, he was the only psychologist serving as a House representative. He's an author. And as a Republican, he served as the U.S. representative from Pennsylvania's 18th Congressional District from 2003 through 2017. And while he was there, he wrote and helped pass the most significant federal mental health legislation in decades, probably ever. And it was called the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act. And it was passed during the final days of the Obama administration. So I want to welcome Dr. Murphy to our conference. And I think he'll be coming on the screen in just a moment. Dr. Murphy, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
I know we had a few little time zone issues there, but thank you for adjusting your schedule.
You bet.
These are always interesting to do it this way, but thank you for taking time. And I've already introduced you. Whatever you want to say in terms of introductory remarks, please do. And we're glad to have you here this morning at Pathways to Hope.
Thank you, Doug. What an honor to be with you and the folks in Texas or wherever else people may be watching around the country. I really appreciate it. But thank you all for your dedication in helping people who are dealing with mental illness. It is an ongoing problem in our country. And today I'm going to talk about what we've done in the past, what we're doing, and where we're going with all this, and try and to speak more, not just as a psychologist, but as a former member of Congress and a former state senator who has tried a number of times to try and deal with this very, very difficult issue and find some solutions for us. We have, well, I'll tell you what, let me try and go to some of my slides here, and I'm going to, if I can get on a screen share, can I do that? Am I there? If you would set me up for screen sharing, Doug, I can get right to that. I think I'm there. Okay, sure. All right. So, what are my slides here? All right, I think we're good. So I'm going to be talking here about the long road ahead, the past, present, and future treatment of mental illness from a policy perspective and work that way. So let's start off and look at, in terms of mental illness, boy, our approach has changed over the centuries. Much of it early on, we looked at culturally, at least in Western culture, you have issues such as a couple of patron saints of mental illness, both had their own issues they dealt with. Saint Delfin, who was escaping an abusive father in Ireland and ended up in Belgium. And actually, she helped set up the whole approach, the way Belgium handles mental illness, that less emphasis on psychiatric hospitals, more emphasis on living in someone's home, almost as a foster patient. Would that be a good term? Saint Benedict Joseph Labre was more of what today we would have thought as a homeless beggar on the streets, but spent a lot of his time in prayerful ways. And the point is, in each of these is to point out that among some cultures, at times, mental illness was not something that was ostracized in society, but there was ways that could be seen as acceptable in society. We don't know exactly what diagnosis they had, but we suspect these were severe mental illness issues. But look at other people that we talk about who have incredible genius: Ludwig van Beethoven, Vincent van Gogh, Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, Jack Kerouac, Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, all had their own struggles. And of course, Winston Churchill, who oftentimes talked about this dark cloud around him of depression, which would come and go. And yet no one would challenge that these were some of the most brilliant minds around. And it can be that way. There's also several people who are monarchs, from Charles VI all the way down through Henry VI, Ivan the Terrible, Maria I, George III in the United Kingdom, which is very important because he was dealing with his own types of mental illness during the American Revolution, and probably contributed to both how the colonies were treated and how England treated the emerging colonies into a new nation, and a lot of that influenced by his mental illness. And King Otto of Bavaria is probably most famously known for those castles and things he built there as part of his outcome. But continuing on here, and I'll figure out how to move my slide. The next one, here we go. But the way we treated mental illness was not just in terms of those happier days and genius. Much of it was fairly brutal. It was the issue of bloodletting, or poultices also put upon people. It was sometimes torture to remove demons from someone, or trephining, opening up holes in someone's skulls. Sometimes that was probably done for medical reasons, where there was swelling and inflammation of the brain. And other times thinking that we were letting something evil out of their brain when this happened. Early institutional was a certain idealism. These more Victorian pictures of what people like to think what Bedlam looked like. Not a nice guys reading the paper, playing cards, playing with the dog. Wasn't that wonderful? Beautiful flowers on the wall. And look at the women's ward, knitting and sewing and just sitting there quietly. But the fact is, that's not the fact. That it was really very much more of incredible abuse, shackles, chained to bed in horrific, horrific conditions that took place. So over the centuries prior, sometimes mental illness was treated as a demonic possession, sometimes as seen as a medical problem as it emerged. But a lot of the way it was treated was imprisonment, shackles, because it couldn't control people. Along came a psychiatrist, Philippe Pinel, who this painting done in 1795 was him releasing those who were insane from their chains at an asylum in Paris. Was a remarkable breakthrough he had. You see everything there from the one attendant removing the shackles from the woman, while another woman on her knees in front of Dr. Pinnell kissing his hand, and other people still shackled to the sides to show what had taken place. A big breakthrough. And in the United States, we had our own version of that with Dorothea Dix, who noted that these institutions, or excuse me, the way we were treating the mentally ill was basically to leave them homeless, leave that up to the family to take care of, to be terribly abused, to oftentimes end up in prison. We weren't treating them, we were abusing them. And Dorothea Dix was this incredible force in America to encourage our nation, our states to open up hospitals, asylums. At that time, asylum wasn't a bad name. And you can still see in movies that were made early on where they joke about sending people to the happy house, sending people to the asylum as a place to send people away. There's a play called Arsenic and Old Lace, which jokes about the concept of sending people away and the way the people who had insanity, who had delusions and hallucinations were treated. And all that may be well, but the reality is how it deteriorated since then. So we did the same thing and expected different results. How do we treat that? Inside hospitals, people oftentimes left to wander. I remember a study that commented that many times those who were insane were oftentimes laying on the floor or wandering back and forth, but you look and realize an architect did an analysis and said, but there are no chairs. This has not gone away. I remember visiting a forensic hospital closer to Pittsburgh, maybe about 10 years ago. And in the day room, they said the same thing. Oh, these guys, they just want to lay on the floor. And I said, how many people do you have here? He said, in this ward, we have 20. And I said, count the chairs. You have 10. Where are people supposed to go? And there's nothing for them to do. Not a single magazine, game, anything in the room. It's incredible boredom. So another thing that happened so much was the crowding, the restraining, tying people to beds. There was still the belief that went on a long time that ended, of course, in the 20th century, the bleeding. There was also a lot of phenomenal physical abuse, forced sterilizations, abortions that took place. Hydrotherapy, you see in the upper right-hand corner, spraying on people hot or very cold water, putting people in ice baths. The lobotomy issue, which was one that happened to President Kennedy's sister, much to the chagrin of the family, realizing that it was not a solution. The things that were done also with emerging psychotherapies began to have some effect. Medication had some effect. And electroshock went from very severe forms of inducing seizures, as was insulin shock, to today recognizing more subtle forms may have some value. But I want you to know that these policy changes and what happens when things come full circle. So hospitals and asylums in the United States grew throughout the 20th century. By 1955, there was almost 560,000 psychiatric hospital institution beds. And at that time, the population of the United States was 165 million plus or so. In 1963, it was President Kennedy who signed the Community Mental Health Act to give federal control to the care of the mentally ill. So community mental health centers popped up all around the country, funded by the federal government throughout the 60s and 70s. By the way, that was like the last bill he signed before he was assassinated, so never had time to follow it through. But what happened a couple of years later was under President Johnson, Medicaid and Medicare were established. That's the good news. The bad news is we're not paying for psychiatric hospitals. So you ended up with the Institution of Mental Diseases and saying that you can't have the same number of beds. And so the number of beds in hospitals began to plummet as states realized, well, how are we going to pay for this? If Medicaid and Medicare are supposed to pay for severe mental illness and they're not, what are we going to do? So what happened in California was very important. And I'm noting how this is a bipartisan problem. That a lot of times for what happened in California in the 1960s and beyond, when Governor Reagan later on signed a bill, but this Lanterman-Petra Short Act was two Democrats and Republican. The vote was 77-1, so a pretty strong bipartisan vote, and supported by the American Civil Liberties Union was the closing of psych hospitals in California. And so that was the beginning of this whole movement to shut them down. And supposedly it was supposed to go to using the community mental health system, which again was growing in the 1970s. In fact, in 1980, President Carter signed a bill expanding the federal role, but it was then in 1983, under President Reagan, returned control back to the states in terms of block grants. Well, what happened was that the closing of these hospitals, institutions was almost inevitable because the federal government said, you have them, but we're not paying anymore. So the state says, well, we can't pick up the tab on this anymore. And if you're saying we can have the money if we move to outpatient care, then that's what we'll do. But what happened is an incredibly bad outcome. The bad things were we ignored a lot of people with mental illness. Our prison populations grew massively, where county jails or parish jails have perhaps 50, 60, 70% of the people with at least some level of mental illness. State prisons, a percentage, 10 to 20% of those with severe mental illness, perhaps 10%. The homeless population grew in terms of the level of mental illness within them. And I didn't finish my sentence there, but half of the people or so with schizophrenia are not getting treatment. What we should be doing is we really should have community mental health, which is well-staffed with a complete array of services provided by people who have the credentials to do this. Now, that is difficult, and I'll get into that in a minute in terms of having the right kind of people to do these things. But many times we don't have the staff. Medication, helpful, but people have to take it. Something new, transcranial magnetic stimulation, magnetic pulses, not electric shock, is very helpful, particularly FDA approved for severe depression. And I've seen it at the clinic that I work at, a lot of really remarkable results with it. Shock therapy, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, mild forms, not severe forms anymore, that has some impact. When I was in the Navy, we had a patient who this was not the scene from the snake pit. He would go down for his ECT and come back a few minutes later and says, that was great. I'm feeling better every day. So we've changed in that approach. Real psychotherapy that's targeted. It isn't just empathic therapies of the days of old, but cognitive behavioral therapy, supportive therapy, directed therapy that is really helping the person who has hallucinations, delusions, depression, to guide them more in what they should do. And supportive housing is what we should be doing more. Not just, certainly not leaving people be homeless under bridges and somehow saying, well, they want to live that way. And I should say that I was talking to in a radio interview about this, and the host actually mentioned that when he has talked to people homeless, many of them said that's what they prefer. I mean, that is the level of ignorance we are dealing with in our society, that people prefer that. Prefer to what? When you're dealing with a lot of paranoia, a lot of abuse, you may think, well, that's better than some of the alternatives. But what would happen if we could really get people in supportive housing? I saw this in California, really model programs where people had an apartment, small, but it was nice. And there was someone at the front desk to check in every day with them. Are you taking your medication? How are you doing today? Get out and do something, exercise. So they weren't forgotten. And I remember one fellow, I sat in his room. It was basically a bedroom, a little kitchenette in a bathroom. And he says, this is the first time in years he was able to leave things out and nobody would not worry about stealing. He said it took him several weeks before he realized at night no one was going to beat him up and rob him. And he preferred that. But that's supportive housing. But there's other movements saying, no, if we just give them housing and leave it up to them, they'll be okay. I'll get back to that in a minute. What we also need is assisted outpatient treatment where actually under a judge saying you are going to get treatment. You need to get this, you're going to stay with it. Assertive community treatment too, where it is you have a group of professionals who sort of surround that person with help. Under ACT, the person voluntarily is seeking that help. Under AOT, there is a level of involuntary in terms of the person not cooperating, but it's still there because a judge is mandating it. It has to take place. And of course, family support is also important too, but unfortunately, we cut families out of a lot of this care too. So when we're not doing what we should be doing, look at this, the massive homelessness problem. Anybody who's been to the Seattle or Portland or LA or San Francisco notices the homeless problem is awful. That during the era of COVID, when more people could work from home and they realized they can move out of these areas, A lot of people have been fleeing city areas, not working there anymore. It's leaving more of a homeless population uncared for, and many of them with severe mental illness that is simply not treated. The dynamics of downtown areas are changing because someone has this idea that, well, that's what they should be doing. That's fine. We'll just give them a tent and a blanket. I think that's absolutely abusive. And what's happened under incarceration is the severely mentally ill who are incarcerated, about 80% of them have no treatment. For example, a jail may get a contract with some company to provide care, but I was talking with one in a county near me, and they have in the county jail something like 380 inmates there in the jail, some awaiting trial, some serving time for local DUIs, et cetera. And they said about 40% of them have some level of suicidal threat or ideation, and about 80% of them have some substantial mental health problems. So the company that provides by contract mental health services for them has one social worker, and they're asking to have another. And they asked me my opinion of that. I says, when you find that 2 social workers can handle a couple hundred people on a regular basis with mental illness and many of them on suicide watch, let me know. I want to attend the ceremony when you win the Nobel Prize for that, because it's not possible that someone could overburden a couple of people. And what happens to those workers? They get burned out. They inevitably will. It's too much. But when we're looking at budgets and people think, can we do this on the cheap? They're going to try that. And we know that people who are in prison start off with a minor crime. They may have been simply a vagrant. They may have done a small crime, stealing something from a local store, taken to jail. Next thing you know, have a fight with policemen. Now they have assault charges on them. They get in fights with the prisoners. They end up in solitary confinement. Lots of problems take place. But without treatment and without training, and we know that Medicaid, for example, doesn't pay for treatment while they're incarcerated. So therefore, states and counties say, well, we're not paying for it. No wonder we have this high recidivism rate. And we know, for example, with schizophrenia, as people get worse, deterioration in the brain takes place. And as you have these repeated things, so let's say schizophrenia, about half the cases of severe mental illness emerging by age 14, 75% by age 24. The longer it goes untreated, and the more crisis a person has, the worse it gets. And of course, we have high recidivism, and it just contributes to this perception of just put them in jail. When California Governor Jerry Brown said we were going to do prison reform, there was a 2/3 cuts in the number of inmates, but there was a massive increase in homelessness, reduced care, and this whole revolving prison door. And during one of our hearings, we had the head of the Cook County Jail in Chicago talk about how when some people are discharged from the jail, they immediately go out and they throw a brick or smash up a police car or do something because they want to get back in because that's the only stable life they know, not the best thing. So why do we have these problems? Well, much of it is total ignorance. They try and do it cheap, but real care actually costs a lot less than care. But so they try and do it cheap. They'll say it's not my problem, and we also think, well, the mentally ill aren't really violent. That's a problem I've often have seen trouble with. A couple of articles I published on this. Talking about, no, that really is a concern about violence, and we should not be talking about it only at such a time as when we see a mass shooting, but we have to address this stuff and prevent it. There's also the issue of anosognosia, so the complete unawareness that one even has a problem. That's what the term means, not aware of the name. Even among colleagues in the professional fields, not aware that perhaps 40 to 50% or more of people with schizophrenia or bipolar are not aware they have a problem, and they're not aware they're not aware. Think of it like this. We understand that a person with Alzheimer's or dementia, if grandma is walking the streets in cold January day, wearing nothing but a bathrobe, talking about how she needs to get to school, we will understand right away this is a deteriorating brain condition. She needs help. So she's not taken to a psychiatric hospital wing and locked and chained to a bed or a handcuff. She's taken to a hospital and provided care. Now, in some cases, a person with Alzheimer's can get aggressive if they misunderstand that situation, but still, hospital personnel understand and treat that with a different kind of compassion. That same kind of anosognosia, however, is also present in stroke victims and people with severe mental illness. The reason this is so important as a problem is there's those out there who perhaps groups who are looking at disability rights, et cetera, and say, well, these people don't want care, they refuse it. But my question is, if they are not aware they have a problem and they're not aware that treatment can make them better, why are we saying that you're fully capable of making the decision? And they're not. And this is where it requires people in the health provider field to be informed, and many are not. Many people work in ERs or criminal justice system, et cetera, are not aware of this. And they assume that if the person is belligerent and difficult and paranoid, they must be doing it willfully, and therefore they need to be treated as prisoners or given a chemical straitjacket or whatever it is. And all this because of ignorance. There's also this illusion of care that almost like, well, we have this. There was a line in Charles Dickens' famous book of Christmas Carol, where Ebenezer Scrooge was being asked to donate money. And he said, well, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And the people asking him to give money says, well, of course, but many people would rather die than go into them. To which Ebenezer Scrooge said, well, then let them die. It'll decrease the surplus population. And that's kind of where we are now too, where literally, CMS, Center for Medicaid Services, when it looks at the cost of care, when they were looking at in my legislation, the cost of care, they actually came through saying that if people with severe mental illness died, it's a cost savings. If we provided care for them, more care, you have to list it as a cost spending. And therefore you had to offset costs. Say, well, where are we going to get the money for this? I'll show you the problems that come up with that. So all of this is also those who oppose reform. I would see repeatedly, they would come to my office and show me pictures and tell stories of what happened before in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and tell me the worst case scenario and say, we should not have more hospital beds. We should not have institutions. We should not do these things because of the problems of the past. What I see is those problems of the past are abuses. And some exist today, and we call them jails. So how is it we're okay with solitary confinements and beatings and recidivism and not giving people medication or treatment? How is it we're okay with that, but we're not okay with having more psych beds? So here's why we can't get reform. A great book by Ron Powers. You may have also heard of the movie that he co-wrote, Flags of Our Fathers. Ron Powers had two sons who suffered from schizophrenia. One of them took his own life. But it's a really good book. No One Cares About Crazy People. And that title of that book actually came from a comment he heard from an elected official saying about that. Also, Insane Consequences, written by the late D.J. Jaffe, really outlines a lot of the problems and of why we're still not getting reform. But there's the disorganized visions or the splintered organizations. So I noticed when I was traveling the country talking about my legislation, I even had to look and see what NAMI organization I was with in which county, because they all had different approaches to what was going on depending upon their approach, their vision. Mental Health America had their approach. The Treatment Advocacy Center had their approach. American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, all these groups had their different approach and didn't gather together. So they had disorganized visions. And all of this delayed or weakened reforms as we presented them in our legislation. Instead of coming together and say, yeah, let's agree to this, we actually found that people were, on the one hand, saying we want to do this, but on the other hand, not. For example, the American Medical Association, I couldn't get them to endorse my bill because the emergency room doctors didn't like the ideas of dealing with HIPAA reform. I'll get to in a second. And I said, shouldn't this be up to the psychiatrists, the people who really deal with mental illness? And within these mega organizations, they couldn't do it. Because what you have is the people in power, in Congress, the White House, et cetera, simply don't know about mental illness, and they're the decision makers. So when I introduced my bill, the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act, we got a lot done, major things. We created the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, changed the way SAMHSA was behaving before. But before, a lot of grants were given out that were everything from making videos to fruit smoothies and posters and paintings, and really look at this concept of prevention of stress as if that was the cause of mental illness. We got them to understand it's severe mental illness. In fact, some of the reports from 2016 of their vision and plan for the year did not even mention the word schizophrenia in it or talk about severe mental illness. We wanted to repeal the IMD exclusion, that is, allow hospitals that have more than 16 beds. We eventually got CMS to say, okay, we're not going to move it up to 16 beds, but we will allow 2 weeks per month to stay in a hospital bed. This is how absurd it got. So if we understand a person to wean off one medication, starting another may take a couple weeks, but what happened was, if you were admitted in a hospital the 1st of September, you're out by the 14th. But if you were admitted by the 15th or 16th, you can stay in the rest of September and the beginning of October. Absurd concept. We didn't get that. We also tried to have HIPAA reforms, which allowed compassionate communications for doctors in the ER to be able to communicate with family to get more history. Right now, they do it in a passive way and say, well, if the family tells me, we'll listen, but otherwise we can't. That still needs to be done because hospitals may not have the medical records and they may be listening to someone who is dealing with delusions, hallucinations, or anosognosia. We want a major increase in research. We want to deal with the provider shortage, which is grossly inadequate. Half the states in America do not have, actually 70% of counties in America do not have enough child and adolescent psychiatrists. They may have no psychiatrists, psychologists, child and adolescent psychiatrists. That is important to have them as it goes through. I believe in Texas, I was looking at some of the counties you have there. And for example, you have some counties like Galveston County, 34 child psychiatrists, Harris County, 154, Dallas, 78. But most other counties have 0. We wanted to pay back the loans of psychiatrists and psychologists, student loans, so they would get in there if they were going to work with severe mental illness. We couldn't get that through because that was considered an expense. We wanted a crisis intervention training for police. We got some of that. We wanted more AOT funding, plus and minus in that we got some. More ACT funding was pushed through. And what happened was a lot of our reforms that passed the House by remarkable numbers, you see on the left, there was a screenshot of the final vote. It was actually 422-2, what we had. But by the time it got to the Senate, a lot of reforms were cut out. And there's President Obama signing the bill. Finally, by December 2016, it was added on to the 21st Century Cures Act without a lot of the changes we wanted. So here's what remains. With severe mental illness, it's still schizophrenia, 8% of the population, but it's 5.2% is overall severe mental illness. You hear people talk about at mass casualty events, it's only 10% of people with severe mental illness. That's not true. If you eliminate non-domestic arguments or non-drug or gang issues too, it's more like 60% or so. There's a 15 times greater incidence of violence if someone is not in treatment with severe mental illness than someone who is in treatment. 11 times increase in the number of victims of crime. It's 10% of law enforcement responses to severe mental illness, 20% of the prison population. In terms of being the perpetrator, when you have severe mental illness, it's a big part of family homicides, 20% of law enforcement fatalities. Acute and chronic illness, 75% of people with severe mental illness have acute or chronic illness and a much shorter lifespan. So what does this mean? Well, what happens is we can't get people's attention until there's a school shooting. Mass casualty definitions changed from going from 4 victims to 3 victims. And when you look at the definition of number of mass casualty events in 2019, it ranges everywhere from 6 to 503. And so when I talk about, is this something we should be paying attention to and looking at this, you have groups that say, well, no, don't emphasize that. Literally people say, this isn't the place to go because these are not people with severe mental illness. But I say, take an opportunity to look for reforms. And besides, what definition of mental illness, of mental health would say homicide is part of this? When you look at school violence, you see this whole history of school discipline problems, bullying, suicide, use of drugs and alcohol, adverse child experiences. Basically, the U.S. Secret Service analysis says there's a lot of early signs of school violence that predict school violence and mental illness. Hard to predict, but we recognize they're there afterwards. But here's the cost. So I'm a member of the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Action Alliance. Please look at the website to see this. But what we found in a study, the annual cost of schizophrenia alone is $281.6 billion. A breakdown shows everything from the reduced life expectancy and the reduced quality of life, $73 billion. Higher healthcare costs, $27 billion. Social Security disability payments, $5 billion. Lost unemployment, reduced wages, 41.6. Justice system interactions, at least 2.3 billion. We believe it's much higher. Incarceration, another 14.5 billion. Supportive housing and homelessness, 24 billion. Caregiver costs, 104 billion. Another way of looking at this, if we looked at the cost of just schizophrenia alone, Look at those states, Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Indiana, Massachusetts. You combine the budgets of all those states, it still doesn't equal what we're dealing with here. And for the 2.65 million people with schizophrenia, annual cost probably 92,000, lifetime cost a few million. And compare this with other federal spending. NIMH 2018 budget dealing with schizophrenia and severe mental illness, 201 million. The SAMHSA budget for 2021, mental health programs, a wide range, oftentimes not treatment, 1.8 billion. Substance abuse treatment, 3.8 billion. Substance abuse prevention, 208 million. Where is the funding to deal with severe mental illness? And it's not there. How about states? Look what states spend the percentage of their budget on mental illness, where you see states like Maine, Pennsylvania, Arizona, New York, and New Jersey have above 3%. Texas, about 1.2% of the Texas budget, and all the way down to Arkansas, 0.7%. Now, look, I understand budgets are different sizes, and they're different sizes of population, but compare that with the whole total state budget, 2-year state budget that I think Texas just passed, 248 billion. So 1.2% of that in a state that has 70% of the counties with no providers, that's a problem. But it's not just for Texas. So what do we need to do? We need to increase psychiatric bed capacity. We need more qualified and dedicated providers in psychiatry, psychology, psychiatric nurse practitioners. We have to stop treating severe mental illness as a crime, provide them care, stop the isolation, use mental health courts. We need more training for police, not just the idea we'll have social workers in a separate car, but police themselves need the training because it's such a big percent of what they're dealing with. We have to reform HIPAA and let families help and increase research into severe mental illness. Above all else, understand this. It's about mental illness. It's not about mental health. We have to remember our mission is prevent and treat mental illness. We must, as organizations and leaders, stay united. Stop the squabbling about what it actually we should be doing. Unite as groups, but keep communicating and keep educating people on the federal, state, and local level to the point where they recognize you as you enter the room, or they go by in the parade and they see you. But understand this, because people oftentimes say, if I write a letter to my congressman, my state senator, my state representative, do they read it? Understand this, the letter you do not write, the email you do not send, the call you do not make are never answered. So focus on those kind of things. Please stay in touch with me. My LinkedIn address, I don't use Facebook or Twitter for reasons I can't stand the approaches there. Go to Tim Murphy, PhD. I saw another Tim Murphy, PhD on there, so make sure it's my face. And my email, that's my direct email, Dr. Tim Murphy, put a dot between the words, @gmail.com. Doug, that's all I have to say today. Unless you have a question or final comment there, I will stop my screen share, and there we are.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. I think you covered a lot of territory, but I think one of the things you emphasized was we all need to advocate for better opportunities for mental health care. So many of these programs start at the local level. I believe for a long time that basic grassroots engagement has the potential to change a lot of this. We're doing some of these things in San Antonio, from jail diversion to grassroots Bridges to Care, which we've started, which is grassroots level education and advocacy and help. I want to thank you for taking your time. We're going to continue the conference here in just a moment, and we'll go into our breakout sessions. And thank you for your remarks. And we think of you as an ally and a champion in the work that we're doing. Thank
Doug,
you.
it's been an honor to be with you. Please, as I said, link up with me on LinkedIn, email if you want. And I put some other things on my LinkedIn site too, some of the articles I wrote about violence, so check them out.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
And if everybody will stay on the Pathways to Hope website, you'll be able to log on to the breakout sessions that will begin at 11:15. So we have about a 15-minute break here before we begin our breakout session. So feel free to take a little personal time, and we'll see you on the other side of this break.